Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Thiago Medaglia. I'm a Brazilian journalist. I'm an independent reporter for National Geographic. And I'm the founder of an environmental news startup called Ambiental Media. But I'm here today as moderator for an important conversation on the topic of populists and strongmen on politics. We have the pleasure today to have the company of 3 journalists and a scientist that will enrich our discussion. I'd like to first thank Milika and Kai, who are the main organizers for this session. Well, these are times of serious threats to democracy and knowledge, as you know, and that brings us, science journalists, to the center of the discussion. How high-quality science journalism can survive and thrive in an age of misinformation and distraction. In order to answer this and other questions, we will listen today to Pablo Ortellado, who is a professor at the University of São Paulo. His work is focused on the intersection between social mobilization, digital technologies, and the public sphere. Pablo is also an opinion columnist at Brazil's major newspaper, Folha de São Paulo. At his side, we have Barış, who is a Turkish journalist, a freelancer, and the founder of Media and Law Studies Association, which seeks to empower journalists and academics in Turkey through legal and professional support in an environment of increased pressure on press freedom. Here on my side, we have Emily J. Gertz from the United States. Emily is a Brooklyn, New York-based journalist and entrepreneur. She's the founder of Deregulation Nation, a newsletter and podcast tracking Trump-era environmental news in the US. A longtime member of the Society of Environmental Journalists, SEJ, Emily has organized digital security workshops to journalists. Finally, we have Thomas Nilsen from Norway. Thomas is editor of the independent Barents Observer. He has a long experience in media cooperation across the borders in the high north of Europe. Thomas is one of the pioneering journalists who have been covering Arctic issues and relations with Russia over the years. Well, our introductions made, now we can officially start our discussion. And my first question is a general one, the same to all of you, which is, how did you find yourself involved in the topic of our discussion today? I will start with you, Pablo.
Hi. So let me talk a little very quickly about my work. I run an interdisciplinary lab at the University of São Paulo. I'm a public policy professor. It's an interdisciplinary lab, meaning that half of our group are computer scientists and the other half are social scientists. So basically what we're doing opinion polls and opinion surveys on one hand and social media analysis in order to understand the polarization of the public sphere, the role of the culture wars, and the rise of populism. Originally, we were investigating what's going on in Brazil. Now we're taking a more international Latin American perspective, doing comparative investigation in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, and Mexico.
Sure. I'll take yours. Hi, so my name is Barış, and thank you for the introduction. I am a journalist, and I haven't been working for an organization since 2015, and the last newspaper that I worked for was shut down by the government after the coup attempt in 2016. And 2 years ago, I started with an associate an organization that offers legal support to journalists as well as professional support, including science journalism and finance journalism focused programs. But currently, there are 150 journalists imprisoned in Turkey, and 8 of them are being defended by our lawyers on a pro bono basis. So I'm a first-hand victim of this increasing populism in in Turkey, and in the context of what it's done to the media industry in general. But I'm also trying to change things, so that's why I'm here.
Thanks for the introduction. So I am a longtime member of this association in the United States, the Society of Environmental Journalists, and I'm now a board member as well of SEJ. And a little bit before my time, though, SEJ started a Freedom of Information Task Force, and this was in the wake of the 9/11 attacks and the new sort of forms of secrecy that the government was imposing and working to impede reporting on government activities on the basis of it being a risk to national security. They grossly expanded the definition of national security to include, for instance, whether a train was going to be coming through your community carrying a load of chemicals. Like, this was information that had been publicly available under our Freedom of Information laws, and now they were trying to lock it up. So this problem has been, I think, in terms of freedom of information, has been building in the US for some time. In the wake of Trump's election, I began to feel that journalists need to just exercise a little bit of personal digital security of their own, and began organizing workshops for this because I do have some connections in the sort of crypto party sphere of people working on digital security for activists, nonprofits, and journalists. And as a member of the Freedom of Information Task Force, we've generally, been doing our best to sort of make nice with agencies and get our point across about why they need to release information. But lately, we're finding ourselves in direct opposition to the environmental agencies in the Trump administration. And I'll say more about that later on.
Thank you. When we started the Barents Observer nearly 20 years ago, we did so because we wanted to provide a global audience with news from the Arctic and about the Arctic. We are based in way beyond the polar circle, the Arctic Circle, up on the border to Russia. So we established the only newspaper in the High North that publishes both in English and in Russian language. This was in a period of time in the 2000s when East and West had a prosperity of oil and gas drilling in the north, people-to-people connection, focus on joint science, on climate changes, etc., etc. But as a newspaper, of course, we also have to focus on problematic changes in the north. And especially after 2012, that has become very obvious with Russia. But it's a problem with us because we are a newsroom based in Norway with thousands of readers in Russia that Russia's security police, the FSB, can't control like they are doing with newsrooms inside Russia. So back in 2015, there was an official request from Russia to Norwegian authorities to shut us down. And the reply was quite easy: that's not the way we do it in Norway. So we continued our reporting. Then from 2017, myself as a reporter who have been traveling in Siberia and northwest Russia for more than 20 years, were declared persona non grata to Russia. So I'm not allowed to go in there and do my reporting anymore. But my colleague still travel, do reporting. We have a huge network of local journalists in the High North on the Russian side. And we could have had even more if it wasn't for the February decision of Russia's Roskomnadzor, the media authority of Russia, to formally block us inside Russia. So unless you use a VPN today, it's not possible for Russian or readers to get access to our information up in the High North. So my short answer to your question, I would really hope that I was not sitting here, but that I was up in the north doing my reporting about climate changes, which is a serious issue up in the High North. But unfortunately, we are forced into a fight for the freedom to write and the freedom to publish.
Well, thank you so much for the introductions. You can see that we have a very rich group of panelists and a great variety of issues to approach. And later on during the session, we will open to questions from the audience. So please take your notebooks and start to think on what you want to ask. I'll start again with Pablo. Now, Pablo, you mentioned your work in the University of São Paulo. Could you share more details on your findings? And I mean, maybe if you can approach this topic on the perspective of sharing with us your idea on what is the extent of the influence of social media in the electoral process nowadays.
Okay, so one of the things when we look at how social scientists, political scientists are looking into the rise of populism is that a lot of the studies are focusing on national history. So the Americans are looking at Trump, the English are looking at Brexit, and we're looking at the 2013 protests in Brazil, and so on. But there must be some international, some global force pushing the rise of populism. So there is a growing consensus that what's going on is the rise of regimes. They have like two common traits. Anti-elite rhetoric on one side, a rhetoric against corrupt elites, corrupt political elites on one hand, and sometimes cultural elites in the universities and the media. So this is one trait. And the second trait, common trait, is some strong leadership that puts themselves as the direct expression of the popular will against liberal institutions such as the judiciary system, the parliaments, and the universities and the media. So, but why this is happening right now? There are mostly four candidates, four good explanations for this, and social media is one of them. The first one is that apparently, some institutions got too powerful and the people are resentful of that. So central banks, constitutional courts, regulatory agencies are not elected and they're too powerful, so they're reducing the reach of the popular sovereignty. People are not able to express them politically and to change the things that are under control of central banks, constitutional courts, and regulatory agencies. The second thing is that the distinction between the right and the left is collapsing, because the left for the 20th century was basically the political force that gave the people more social rights. And when the state got into fiscal crisis because of the growth of the pension systems, so the left didn't have more funds. The state didn't have additional funds to provide the people with additional social rights. So the right and the left was not very different. So this probably made the collapse of the political system. Because of that, the political system embraced the culture wars, that is, the rise of social topics such as abortion, gay marriage, the legalization of drugs. So this came to the center stage, and there is a huge polarization of the public sphere because those are moral issues and they're really divisive. And finally, social media, they lowered the entry barriers to the political system. It's cheaper and it's easier to launch a political movement and to become a major player exploring those changes. So I think these are the main things that explains why we're seeing a rise of populism, because the trust in political institutions collapse, the political system collapse, and there are new ways of populist forces to express themselves.
Thank you, Pablo. Barış, since we have a lot of science journalists in the audience, could you share with us, I mean, in daily basis, in practical terms, how science journalists are facing the challenge of practicing their work in a country where the level of democracy considerably decreased?
Okay, well, very good question. Like Pablo said, we see these elements of populism affecting every journalist, of course. And one is, what you said is the leaders see themselves as the manifestation of the popular will, which is the start of, the erosion of rule of law, basically. And so what happened in Turkey is that as a journalist, you knew that the government had certain red lines and at some point, and that you should not be reporting about them. And these were not initially, not directly related to science. So that would be, he's very clear that he doesn't want his, family or corruption allegations to be written about. And so there are areas in which you could operate. And also, apart from journalism, I don't want to bore you with a lot of, history of the past 2 decades, but this government also made structural changes to key scientific institutions in Turkey, starting in 2011. That changed the way made to appointments to the main scientific research agency, TÜBİTAK, and then the government started appointing in its own, select people. These are defined as in the law as basically autonomous organizations. This and TÜBA, this Academy of Sciences, and these have. I think a very damaging impact on science policy in general, and also it has reflected on education as well. And in 2017, Turkey officially took evolution of the school subject. So as this is going on, this general ideological look, I think it's a good way to look at it. And coming back to journalism, and after some while, and what you said about everything being a national security concern, these red lines of the government started changing. So as a journalist, you don't know what to report on. And any journalist came under direct threat of being taken to court for their work. And I'll give you one example, but you can enumerate this, of a science journalist. So there is, this is an ongoing trial, but there's a scientist called Bülent Şık, and he also writes a column, much like you. And in the past, he was involved with a Mediterranean university in very detailed research concerning 2 regions in Turkey that affects basically about 8 million people. And this is in Turkey usually known as the Ergene report, but there was actually a southern town as well. And during their research in this university, it was probably a decade long. They tested the water, land for contamination, and there were findings of a lot of heavy metals, other toxic remains, especially in the Ergene region. And this was something known to society in general. But the research results basically put very solid linkage between especially in the Ergene River, and the increased cancer rates in the region. So this was something known, but he had basically solid proof. And okay, to wrap it up, overall, the health ministry, which was working in connection with this university, did not publish these findings. So he started a series, and he wrote this in a newspaper. It's actually a print newspaper in a series. And now he's facing charges of abusing his duty, and disclosing secret documents, and these are not state secrets actually, and a third charge which I forget. So this is an example of these red lines which they relate to, again, national security. They try to, he's accused of trying to cause a public scare, but I think it should be remembered that all of this goes hand in hand with science policies, and it's not just a part of an attack on journalism, but a part of this attack that populists have this right to just exclude everything, every institution that doesn't fit in with their own ideology. And it's part of that. And the examples of science journalists being persecuted can be enumerated, or same thing has happened with finance journalists. So now those red lines, you don't know, and you can get in trouble. But of course, as a scientist and as a columnist, he was doing his duty to the public, basically.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us. Emily, I have 2 questions for you now. So you work and you live in an area where democracy has a higher level of consistency comparing to our countries and many others. So could you share with us which are the challenges that science journalists are facing now in the US? Because I think this is a red flag for globally speaking. And the second question is, if you could speak a little bit more with us, share details on your work with digital security for journalists.
Okay. Well, I think that the challenges, well, let me start by saying, I feel as if those of us who have been covering the environment and science were in some ways in the vanguard in our profession of being confronted with the kinds of misinformation and disinformation campaigns that are now basically afflicting our entire, civic sphere. But unfortunately, I don't think that prepared us very much for just the scope of what's the shift under Trump in the United States. I mean, you have to realize that he's been president for 2 years, but he's been campaigning for 3, and from the start, he was attacking the news media. So you've got now 3 years of build-up, his sort of incitement of public distrust of media, combined with his administration's grip on all the federal agencies that produce a lot of the data that we rely on, as reporters to do our work. Right after the election, but before he was inaugurated, for instance, there were several totally spontaneous efforts based at universities, for instance, to download and secure as much climate data off federal websites as possible before Trump came into office, because we had already experienced 8 years of very untrustworthy data coming out of the Bush administration, who regularly hid data or failed to publish data or hide. When I say hide, I mean doing something that a lot of presidential administrations have done, which is hide it in databases that are so arcane and difficult to use that it's effectively unavailable to anyone but people who take the time to learn how to use those databases. So those kinds of things, but then also outright just sort of not publishing data. So we had kind of a nice time under Obama. There were certain issues with Obama and the press, but lack of scientific and ecological data was definitely not one of them. So getting at the data is hard now, harder than it was. Being able to trust the data that we're getting is something that you probably need to take more time to evaluate. Scientists who work with the government are under a lot of pressure to either not talk to the press or they're being shunted out of their expert advisory positions through a variety of bureaucratic mechanisms. So that's a big problem, because then, like at our Environmental Protection Agency, the so-called expert panel now has a big contingent of representatives from industry. Basically, regulated industries have totally captured our environmental protection and our, energy, fossil fuel drilling and such agencies. So the level of skepticism that you have to approach them with now is quite high. And what was the second question? Oh, and digital security. Yeah, so this was a personal interest, frankly, not something that came up a lot professionally, and I would say not something that American journalists working primarily inside the United States, which I do, was something that we really had to concern ourselves with too much in the contemporary era, contemporary since like the 1980s. But I think some of the trends that Pablo discusses about the rise of, ease of use of social media, it's also been a parallel rise in more widespread knowledge on how to hack and crack and socially hack, even not technologically hack into people's accounts. And I think for journalists, it's one thing. independent or freelance journalists have less support than staff journalists in both learning how to protect their information and also having backup if something happens to them. But then there's also the question of what happens to our sources. And so what I've been doing is after I had sort of, I used to be more of a technologist than I am now, frankly, in digital news and digital content. And so I have a lot of just friends and former colleagues. After Trump's election, I began to reach out to some people and learn how to put on, how to train people on using VPNs, picking out encrypted tools, but most important of all, understanding what can't be protected and how you assess your relative level of risk. And I've been striving to teach more journalists this just in the name of sort of digital hygiene, even if you're someone who isn't necessarily on the front line of this kind of attack. And it's been a hard sell, I would have to say. People are resistant to the notion that our democracy in the United States is moving into a state that this might become necessary.
Thank you. Thomas, I can personally relate with your work as an environmental journalist, and I would really like you to share with our audience what are the strategies. I mean, as long as that doesn't compromise, or don't compromise the work that you are doing, of course. But if you could share in details the strategies that you guys are proceeding to continue with your work on the border with Russia.
Yes, our main goal is, I think that authorities who are afraid of journalism are authorities that have something to hide. So what do we as reporters do then, working up in the Arctic? Well, first of all, we have to team up with those who want to reveal information, that think that actually it is important for the society, for everyone, to get access to information that authorities want to keep secret. And those people, they exist. So for instance, when we are writing stories about oil spill on the tundra up in the Nenets area in the northern part of Russia, that is typically information that will not come out to public from the oil companies or from regional authorities. But there are always locals, there are always people that take photos, send it out, people that we can talk to, scientists, not least to speak about scientists working up in the Arctic and that really are concerned about the situation. So for us, based, especially for me that are not allowed to travel to Russia anymore, I depend very, very much on my colleagues on the Russian side that can help me find these people. And then we write the stories. But of course, it doesn't help writing the story if our audience in Russia cannot read the stories because we are blocked there. So simultaneously, we have to work on alternative ways of publishing our stories. And then again, I have to turn to my colleagues in Russia. So we can publish the story on our servers here in Europe for a global audience. And then we have a local, small, very, very brave newsrooms and journalists in northwestern part of Russia and in the Russian Arctic that republish our articles. And we are also using different kind of platforms to get our stories out. So it's hard to make any conclusions after being blocked only for, it's 4.5 months now. But it's no secret that we do actually have more readers today than we had before the authorities in Russia blocked us. And that is because that caused a lot of attention. What is this kind? What kind of newspaper is this? Why are they blocked? Why are the authorities afraid of what they are publishing? So by that we have got many, many more articles. And that's also my short answer to that question. And the main strategy, someone trying to block journalism should only be met by more journalism.
Fantastic. Yeah, there's a current situation in Brazil where The Intercept is publishing a series of conversations between judicial authorities, and the way that they are denying that the judge And the prosecutors, the way that they chose to deny the conversations is making very clear that they are real. So they usually say that they don't think that those messages are authentic. But if they are authentic, they are not a huge problem. So it's pretty clear that they are authentic. And it seems to me, and I want to ask and share that with you, that authorities are not, it's not clear to them how disruptive technology can be. So this seems to be a long-term battle, right? Do you see the scenario for the next year as, is there a trend of continuous growth of populists and strongmen on politics? And how should we, as a community of scientists and science journalists, how should we deal with that situation? That's the same question for all of you. You can start, Pablo, if you want, and you guys can jump right after. And after that, you in the audience will have the chance to ask questions.
Well, as I said, I think there are structural changes in our societies. They're making the way for populist movements and populist governments, so the risk is serious. But countries are reacting to those governments differently. In some countries, they are limited by constitutional power. So they are not they are tensioning the constitutional system, but the institutions are preserved. Other countries have just collapsed under the pressure of populist leaders. So our battle, in my opinion, is to, when you're in this situation like we are in Brazil and other countries, is to really resist. We on one side must resist to preserve the guarantees to protect human rights, to protect freedom of the press, to protect the autonomy of universities on one hand, and on the other hand we must understand why the system is collapsing, and we must provide alternative answers. Because people are complaining that the system isn't working, and it's not enough just to say those answers are not good. We must provide alternative answers.
Yeah, I completely agree with both speakers. So in the case of Turkey, when we're talking about total media capture, and where, let alone science journalism, any journalism is under great threat. I also told you guys just now that there are 150 journalists in prison. One reason they're in prison is because people still keep on reporting, even though most of the mainstream media has been taken over by the government media. And this is something that should go on. And I don't think journalists should be in a dark position, you know, where they're also activists. But sometimes, I mean, it takes a toll, and then people pay a price for what they're doing. But I think it's a price that is worth paying for keeping the institutions alive, or remaking them, recreating them once and after these periods in our countries are over. And they will most certainly come to an end, because yes, that system was not working, but this system is not working either. And like in Turkey, voters after a while change these, and there will be, I think, room for a new consensus, a new maybe social contract, to think, to ensure that this never happens again. And this also includes journalism and how to protect journalism. So it could, if people stand their ground, no matter at what cost, or academics in Turkey, universities are also under a lot of threat. Many have left the country, including a lot of scientists, because of these charges against. They signed a petition, 1,200 academics, including many scientists, signed a petition criticizing Turkey's operations, state security operations in 2015 and 2016 in our Kurdish cities, where there were many alleged civilian deaths, and then now there's cases against them. They're being accused of terror propaganda, and many of them have left the country. But and I don't have anything against those who have left. Nobody has to deal with this. But if you stay your ground, and it's not a good wording, but maybe, yes, if you want to do your job as a journalist, like Bülent does, then unfortunately there's some sacrifices that have to be made. And our role is try to minimize these and make life easier for everyone.
Thank you.
Well, if the question is, what do journalists do? I think in the United States, this is maybe a counterintuitive answer, but I think in the United States context, the thing we need the most right now is we need a healthy news industry. We need a news industry that can support journalists with a living wage. And that, the sector of the industry that can do that is shrinking all the time. I mean, I'll bet you while I've been sitting on this stage, some journalists have been laid off. And I'm not joking. It sounds funny, but I'm completely serious. Our institutions for protecting freedom of information and the right of journalists to get at information are pretty robust. And I mean, they're definitely being pushed right now, and some are being pushed to their limit. In the case of my organization and our freedom of information work, we had the very unusual experience last week of we put out a public letter protesting a move by our Environmental Protection Agency to change freedom of information access in a way that we said was illegal and designed to give political appointees a lot more power to stop information from coming out, and then also not even reveal that the information exists. EPA responded in a press release and named us by name, society, and that is a very unusual thing. The level of personalization that this administration is bringing to its attacks on the press. So that requires some mental recalibration, and I think a lot of us American journalists are struggling with that because we do have this sort of self-image of our democracy as being so, it's certainly corruptible, but robust, and we're now discovering all the places where the weaknesses lay. But I can't really, I think, so first of all, the industry needs to be healthy. Second of all, we need to keep calling them out when they try to undercut freedom of the press and access to information. Third is, I think, we need to unite, and I'm seeing some really good signs of that. Journalism organizations in the United States, we're starting to coordinate our freedom of the press efforts much more than ever in my roughly 10 or 11 years of being on this task force. So that's very exciting. And I think also for our own sakes and our society's sakes, we need to sort of begin to do our work in the understanding that we are not the end of the project. We are the means. Like a free press is supposed to uncover problems, or let's just say more objectively, the free press is supposed to present information, accurate information to the public so that the public can then act as it sees fit or needs to act. And that piece in the United States has been weakening for decades. And I think when we as journalists act as if we are the be-all and the end-all of saving our societies from populists and strongmen, we're taking on more than we can manage, and also more than realistically our profession is meant to accomplish. We're a piece of a process, and I think as a profession we need to begin to help revive civic participation in addition to doing our work as well as we can.
Thank you so much. It's amazing to listen to you all, and just to make a quick comment on what you just said. You mentioned how healthy the industry should be, and I think this is a concern that it's pretty clear at this point that all of us have to deal with that, right? Have to think on how to finance our work. This is a current concern that we all should share. And also you mentioned that organizations are working together, journalists are getting together. I think that's very important in the global context, right? Organizations from different parts of the world joining forces, that's very important. Thomas, would you like to add something on this topic of the scenario for the next 2 years, and in your point of view, how to deal with this long-term battle against populists?
I'm so old that I used to say that everyone trying to predict a year from now, they will be wrong. So I will not try to do that, but let me just give a few comments to the situation as I see it in our part of the world, and in northern Russia. I see a change. I see that the audience, the readers and the viewers and the listeners, they start to kind of turn away from state-controlled media in Russia. They do not trust necessarily so much Rossiya Сегодня or what is on Vesti, the state news TV programs, because I think the governmental controlled media, they have gone too far. People realize that what's actually happening out in the world is not what they see on TV. What is said on TV is something different than people see on the street. And then I mean readers, listeners, and so on, they are again trying to find where is the real fact here. And then they are the very best to make the difference between the Barents Observer on one side, the New York Times on the other side, and what is governmental propaganda TV series. And that's the reason why I'm optimistic. I think that as long as we focus our journalism on facts, on being unbiased, I think objective, I think the future is bright for our work. But that doesn't come by itself. It's hard work all the time. Right now, today, we are fighting on a story that you could see on the Barents Observer about an accident happened in the Barents Sea 2 days ago, where 14 submariners died in an accident that Russian authorities is, just before we came into the room here, out saying that everything related to this accident is classified, it's state secret because it involves military submarine. And by that they hope that non-journalists in Russia will ask critical questions about what happened on board this submarine, why did the sailors die, and so on. And I'm sure the readers, the people out there, they are looking for the truth, not to hear that it's state secrets.
Yeah, I think what you say about unbiased reporting right now is a super challenge. I mean, in the United States, we really have this stark difference between, we have two major political parties. One has literally embraced rejection of science. And I mean, it's in their written platform. Climate deniers, people who sincerely disbelieve in climate change, are now at the highest levels of the American government. And they are all from one political party. And it's not that the other political party doesn't, you know, sometimes has lacked urgency on the issue of climate change, for instance, but they are the party that is still part of the Western Enlightenment, you might say. And that presents a lot of challenges for reporters too, because you simply can't find both sides on an issue in a knee-jerk way. You've got to go digging around, and I think fortunately more people are starting to embrace the fact that you just can't go to a Republican lawmaker for comment on whatever, cap and trade, because they're just going to bullshit you, and you've got to start digging harder for counter movements within conservatism in order to maintain some, to maintain an even hand with both sides of a policy question or a science question.
Very good. Yeah, I think at this point it's pretty clear that the old formula on listen to both sides equally. It's pretty clear that we need to put some context in our stories, right? So I'm gonna open the space for questions from the audience. Would someone would like to raise your hand and make the first question? Come on, journalists. Okay, there is someone there. You should have a mic with you, just to, oh yeah, if you can. Thank you.
Hi, I understand everything that all of you said. It makes a lot of sense. I also come from India, where we face similar problems. My question is about Turkey. Many of these problems had cropped up in the first term of Erdogan. Not as much as now, obviously, now that he has consolidated his power. What happened then? Because I think in many other parts of the world, Erdogan's term in Turkey was watched very closely. And we always thought that if he wins, we'll get an idea of what's in store for us. He did win, but what happened to the press in the first term?
Thank you.
I'll give a quick summary, and this is a very good question because, of course, this did not happen overnight, and the ownership structure, media ownership structure, had eternally been very problematic in Turkey, and maybe one thing we should say about Turkey is that Turkey was not a dream democracy land before AKP. For some segments of society, it was always they always had pressure on the Kurds, the Armenians, the LGBTI community. In the case of the press, in a nutshell, most of the press, mainstream media, were owned by families that also had businesses in the economy, in other segments. That made, of course, their reporting very questionable in some respects. And also they had the power to actually influence governments and even change governments. If you've heard of what they call in Turkey's a postmodern coup in 1996, that was actually the media's doing. They actually brought down a government. And that's why people bought media, to have influence so that they could get more contracts. And when Erdogan became very popular, because initially the media ignored them, and when they started getting more votes, and as they grew, they had this idea. For one thing, they very rightly said, we don't want to be excluded from the media anymore. And secondly, they said, we can use this to ourselves. And using a body called the State Deposit Insurance Funds, which was founded after a crisis in 2000, to secure, Turkey's banking system, to get people's, bankrupt businesses' money back. Using that, they changed media ownership, and they had their own cronies buying media, and most of which we know were now compensated from discretionary state budget. And so, for the first time in Turkey, you had business people buying media, not because they wanted to influence the government, but because they still wanted to continue being in these tenders. And actually, we know from phone conversations that they came out that they were ordered to buy this media. So over the past 2 decades, the media changed hands, and according to our Union of Turkish Journalists, now 95% of print and news media and TV media are in the government's hands. So that's what happened. And in those 2 decades, of course, there were a lot of journalists were out of jobs. The mentorship system collapsed entirely, and journalism, especially in the mainstream media, became something else. But of course, this all happened thanks to the previous structure of the problematic media ownership in Turkey. Basically, sorry if that was too long.
It was not. It was perfect. So, does anyone has another question? So I will ask. Okay, she's bringing you the microphone. I will ask you, please, to make very objective questions.
Thank you. I have a question about your sources, because you both mentioned working with locals and with scientists who want to come forward and tell their stories. But in certain regimes, I presume that would put them at quite a risk of persecution, perhaps. And so I was wondering, how much responsibility do you as journalists take for the safety of your sources, and how do you work with them to ensure that they won't have to suffer for coming forward?
I will also ask you to say your name, please.
Sorry, my name's Inga. I work for research.
Fantastic. When you make a question, you can say your name and your country, please. You want to go, Thomas?
I can be very honest on the answer to that question, which is a very serious question that we have been working on for a very, very long time. We have to admit to all our people we are talking to that we cannot keep sources anonymous. We cannot guarantee our sources that authorities, the Russian FSB or anyone is listening to our conversation, tapping our Skype talks, reading our emails and so on. And I think as long as we are very open on that, no one can, that the Barents Observer, we cannot protect our sources. So if people talk to us, they need to be out there with their names, etc. and so on. And that is very well known up in the north in regards to us.
Would you also like to speak about sources in Turkey, or?
Well, exactly. Fear of retribution, people not talking out. But I think I agree. Most journalists now want to ask to have names. But I want to give another example of which is a violation of protection of sources, the principle. But it happens the other way. So you can be accused on the basis of your sources a lot, and so it's again the same disrespect to the same rule. And for example, now we have a journalist in prison, and he is accused of the membership of a terrorist organization based on his news reports and all these phone conversations, transcripts of phone conversations he had with people, and these go on for 70 pages, and he talked to local politicians, local people, and this is. It's when you read it, it's what we do every day. All of us do. It's he's trying to fix interviews or he's getting a comment, and based on his sources, he's being accused. And secondly, all of the sources who talked to him are now in a public indictment, with every single word that they said. So it's a very big concern, very good question how to protect these sources, and it's public, it's open to everyone, and every word is in the indictment, in the transcript.
Thank you. Does anyone would like to?
I have the microphone already before you called on me.
Okay, where are you? Okay, thank you. Can you say your name and your country, please?
So I'm Dana Priest, and I'm from the Washington Post. I worked there for 30 years, and now I'm a professor also at the University of Maryland. And first I wanted to say that we're having a panel tomorrow on protection of sources, if you want to learn more about this. My question is, I have my students write about imprisoned journalists, and we started an organization called pressuncuffed.org, and I'm trying to grow it now. So my question is twofold. One is, do you notice that there are more journalists who do science or environmental or science or environmental reporting that are in prison in your countries or other countries that you know about? And then secondly, I'd like to just get some of your ideas about how to make the issue of imprisoned journalists a bigger issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are very good questions. I can say that in Brazil, I think it's honest to say that for the first time, like, environmental journalists are targets. I mean, more than during other governments. You guys want to make comments? Do you have a perception of more science journalists in prison or?
Not when in regards to Russia, it's not necessarily environmental journalism that is the most difficult part, but there is a trend, especially over the last year, that more and more journalists are taken into custody. It all topped some few weeks ago with a journalist of the Medusa newsroom that were arrested and accused of I don't know how many grams or kilos of narcotics they found in his apartment, but then the police did such a terrible job that everyone could discover that it was actually not his apartment that where these drugs were in. And that triggered thousands of people in Moscow and other cities in Russia to go out in the street to protest the arrest of this journalist. And as you know, it's not allowed to make unsanctioned protests, so everyone lined up and had a one-man protest on the streets, both in St. Petersburg and Moscow. But yes, focus on imprisoned journalism is very important. Write about it, get people out in the streets.
To your question, I think I don't think we have any journalist in prison who is now in prison because of a science journalism story or an environmental journalism story, but I can see that happening. It could happen, especially in environment, because we have a similar case from the Gezi, the civil society trial, which is linked to environmental concerns. To your question, how to emphasize imprisoned journalists, this is what we're trying to do, and this is one of my, most of my time is being spent on times of advocacy, and I think the biggest problem is that, especially in the overall in the world, I know everybody's energies and resources are limited, but what happens is organizations, international organizations, including press freedom organizations or formal bodies, are focusing a lot on well-known or famous individuals. And I see this as a big problem because it turns the other people into numbers. And we have some great journalists who've done great local journalism who are in prison, but they're not being campaigned about as strongly as as others are being, because they're basically quote unquote nobodies, or they're not in the right tribe. And this, we see this a lot happening with Kurdish journalists in Turkey, for example. And you see these indictments; they completely fall under Article 10 of the Convention. And like this guy who's just basically have a transcript of phone conversations, and he was given 9 years in prison. And unfortunately, I'm thinking that at international legal mechanisms, this also, I'm going to be trying to be diplomatic, but I think this also affects how the courts, international courts, also view the applicants, a level of their celebrity and fame. And I think this is something we should be changing. This is something international organizations should work a little bit more on not excluding people who are not so famous, because they're in prison for the wrong reasons and for trying to bring out the truth.
Thank you.
So as Dana, I'm sure you know, I mean, imprisonment of journalists in the United States on any beat is not a big problem right now. But what I did want to just mention is that the potential for the criminalization of certain kinds of journalistic investigation is growing, and on beats that pertain to science. There are a number of laws, we call them ag-gag laws, in some parts of the country, where if you reporters who try to sort of infiltrate agricultural, like meat packing or livestock or other kinds of agricultural industry sites, and report on them, they can be arrested under those laws and prosecuted. And recently there's a Supreme Court decision came down that effectively broadened the notion of trade secrets that can be withheld from freedom of information requests. And so again, if a journalist publishes something like that, there's now there's room for prosecution. So that gets again back to the health of the industry, is if reporters have got no one at their back, or if local press is dying because it can't make a go of the business side, then a lot of this stuff is not going to get reported.
Fantastic. Do you want to make any comments on this?
I just want to comment one thing about Brazil. I don't think we have a problem with imprisoned journalists, but we have a problem with journalists being killed, especially in faraway areas. It's not only Brazil, it's in Mexico also, and other Latin American countries. So, especially where the state cannot protect people from local conflict, in places where there is really environmental disputes, journalists are dying. And right now, Brazilian government, for instance, is not interested in protecting journalism, especially environmental journalism, because they see this as a threat to national sovereignty, in their opinion.
Yeah, that is true. We are almost in the end of our session. Would someone like to make another question? Please. Can you say your name, please, and your country?
Yes, my name is April Tash. I work for UNESCO in Paris, the UN agency, specialized agency for science. I've been following the matters of the freedom of speech in the sciences for several years. And so I have a question related to that, because I see that most of this panel has been about freedom of expression in this area, although we've been talking about journalists. So if you like, my background is as a human rights lawyer, and I'm looking for the ways that the law can protect the individuals. And each of you has spoken about situations in specific countries and specific places, but my perspective is more about how we can get the international level and the international institutions, as one of the panelists just mentioned, to be more implicated so that we could have more common standards that protect people everywhere where they do their work. The reason I wanted to ask a question is because there is an agreement, recent agreement, that's not very well known, which is developing on the freedom of the scientists. So freedom of expression, which is important for the journalists, is also important for the scientists for their work. It's the freedoms involved in this new agreement from 2017 also attached to the scientists in terms of their autonomy to do their work, their intellectual freedoms, their freedom to publish, their freedom to talk to the press. There has been, in the last few years, some restriction on this in Canada, an attempt to write a law that would require registrations of foreign researchers in Indonesia, and there's several other cases. So while we look a lot at what's happening in Turkey, there are many other places where there are many other ways to restrict the freedom of scientists to do scientific investigation. And because this agreement came to the conclusion that it would be reasserted and it was unanimously agreed,
I'm sorry, I have to ask you to ask the question, please.
To be short, it is going to be monitored. And so there's a Human Rights Council in the UN system that every 4 years monitors these things. There's also a violations procedure where individuals can come. I'm wondering why these cases haven't been brought to those systems, and if you've taken to heart that there's both protections for journalists and protections for scientists in the human rights system.
You wanna, so you have to grab another one. Sorry.
I just want to say briefly that SEJ has been trying to help Canadian journalists with some of these, Canadian journalists in Canada, with some of these problems in our usual way, which is we start a dialogue with the agency in question and sort of try to combination of cajole and shame and publicize them into freeing their scientists to talk with reporters. But I guess I'm going to say that I'd like to challenge the notion that these institutions are going to be as powerful as maybe they arguably were going forward in kind of the new shift of power in the world, and whether this is a good use of our time in terms of protecting both scientists and journalists.
Okay, I'm not going to take much of everybody's time, and we can talk after, but basically, of course, for many journalists, we use, as a civil society organization, and other lawyers as well, and I'm not a lawyer, use especially European mechanisms, and outside European mechanisms, the Council of Europe, the Court of Human Rights, and like I said, there could have been a higher number of applications from journalists in prison, I agree, and there are many reasons why not, but in what we have, so far since the coup, the court has ruled only in the cases of 2 journalists, and the civil society at large, I'm not here to criticize the court, is very unhappy about these decisions, although it did find violations. But one thing for the Court of Human Rights, again, I'm not here to criticize the court, I want it to be strong, but there's a lot of a sense in Turkey that, not that it's not useful, but there is a belief that there is a not very transparent mechanism of communication with Turkey, the government. There's the timing of some constitutional court rulings in the case of journalists, and the European Court are very suspiciously always very close. The decisions are very close, and some of their, I think these mechanisms should be more transparent, and there's doubt, and maybe I can give you examples as a lawyer, where you see one journalist in the exact same situation with a very good application being found inadmissible, and another one who's more famous you know, the court reviewing this case, and this has given to a lot of doubt. And more human rights lawyers in Turkey are talking about looking to other mechanisms, such as UN mechanisms as well. So that's a good idea, and I think we'll be seeing more of it. So there's some loss of faith in the court of, you know, the European court in general. But I still think it works, and it can still get people out of jail.
I mean, in the case of, there are definitely scientists being pressured by the US government and kicked out of their jobs in some cases for talking to the press. I don't know, the United States has a history of not participating in a lot of these mechanisms, and so end of story, you know?
Yeah. Unfortunately, we have to end our session because we don't want to be in the way of the next session, but I wish we could have much more time, but I want to thank our panelists a lot. This was a very rich discussion, and I just want to leave one last thought here. That I think, in my opinion, that, I mean, it's, yes, it's true, there is a raging fire against democracy and journalism right now, but I do believe that our everyday work is very important and can make a difference, especially if we join forces. So thank you so much, and enjoy the conference.